This program, Words Like Freedom, will feature Dr. Yaba Blay, author of One Drop, and moderator Dr. Courtney R. Baker, June 19th, 12:15 p.m. Available for purchase online from the Schomburg shop at schomburgshop.com is the featured book, One Drop, Shifting the Lens on Race.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Courtney Baker, an associate professor of English at the University of California, Riverside, and I'm thrilled to be in conversation with my colleague, Dr. Yaba Blay, author of the book, One Drop, Shifting the Lens on Race, for this, the third annual Schomburg Center Literary Festival. I'm speaking to you today from the Lenape territory of Mannahatta, where the Schomburg Center is also located. As this festival and conversation falls on Juneteenth, the day that enslaved Texans learned of the end of their illegitimate enslavement several months after chattel slavery was abolished. And in a current moment, when there is a powerful movement to halt all Black study, I am overjoyed to be engaged in Black study and in discussing the important work of Dr. Blay. Many thanks to the staff at the Schomburg, to Novella Ford, Kalila Bates, Chris Burgum, all who have made this event possible. Also, many thanks to the ASL interpreters and live captioners for making this event accessible to our communities. At the end of this presentation and conversation, audience members are invited to submit questions to the author. Please send them at any time using the chat function. Now I'm going to briefly introduce Dr. Blay and begin our conversation. Dr. Blay is a dark-skinned, kinky-haired, first-generation, American-born Ghanaian who identifies as Black with a capital B. She is a scholar, activist, cultural creative, and consultant whose scholarship, work, and practice centers on the lived experiences of Black women and girls with a particular interest in body identity and beauty politics. Dr. Blay's commentary is featured in A Changing America, 1968 and Beyond, a permanent installation exhibited in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And she recently appeared on Kamau Bell's CNN broadcast, United Shades of America. She is a thought leader on Black racial identity, colorism, and beauty politics, all subjects that her book, One Drop, explores in depth. Welcome, Dr. Blay, and thank you so much for this book.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This magnificent book, which, as I said, I feel like is very essential to the kind of freedom study for the history and the ongoing evolving nature of Blackness that is really being suppressed in many ways in this moment. And your book, and since it's a literary festival, I might say that it really illustrates the importance of books, of cooled down, slowed down, thoughtful takes, even though there are a lot of conversations about race that are occurring online in quick sound bites. And I was wondering if you could say something about why you felt that this project and this exploration needed to be slowed down, elongated into the kind of precious form of the book. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you know, the book is a visual project as well. People have come to call it a coffee table book. And originally, I published the book independently in 2013, primarily because I had a difficult time convincing the publishing industry to take it on. You know, at the time, there are questions about its importance, but also about its costs because it involves full color photography. And for me, with this particular conversation, there was no way that I could have a conversation about skin color politics and racial identity without partnering that with people's images. But this particular conversation on race, as you say, in terms of a slowed down version of it, you know, my training is in Black studies and in women's and gender studies. And in a lot of ways, I think the public conversations around race, people take for granted that they know what race is, right? And in the same way, they take for granted that they know what racism is. And so if I reflect on my own education, K through 12, I mean, it's one thing to talk about what I didn't learn about Black history. It's another thing to talk about what I didn't learn about myself, right? And in many ways, the histories and the experiences that we did learn about were very much not just watered down, but like censored, edited. They met other people's needs and not my own. And so as I started engaging in public conversations about race, particularly not even just public conversations, but conversations with my students when I was still teaching, again, just recognizing how much we don't know about race, and not just race as a thing, as a topic, but race as a lived experience, right? Which for me, one thing that I very much value about my training in Black studies and women's and gender studies is the opportunity and the privilege to center myself in the work that I do, right? To think critically about whatever it means to be objective, right? There was no demand that I separate myself from my work and look at those people over there as opposed to looking at myself, ourselves. I was allowed to say my people, in the work that I do. And so in centering myself, I recognize how much of what I thought I understood about race was predicated upon what people look like. And because so much of my work is around colorism, I was seated in so much colorism, so much conversation around colorism, dark skin, light skin, right? But then also having been born and raised in New Orleans, right, which we all know is one of the Blackest cities in the United States, also a very magical, spiritual space. There's a long history of race there, performative race in a lot of ways. Right? And when we look at the lived experiences of Black folks in New Orleans, a lot of that history is connected to skin color politics. When we talk about, Black, white, and gens de couleur in the middle, folks who come to identify as Creole, much of what I experienced as a little girl is I knew that I was dark skinned before I knew how to spell my own middle name, because people made it such a reference point, and so there was a shield that I created. My identity is very much grounded in my complexion, and similarly, my relationship to people who aren't my complexion is very much grounded in the experiences that I had. And so that very much informed all that I thought that I knew about race and race politics. And so I thought it would be interesting, if not helpful, to again, as opposed to thinking about race as a scientific project or even race as a political project, to still talk about the science and the politics, but to also connect it to lived experience as a way to get people to not necessarily just connect with my story, but to find their story in here somewhere still, no matter
And
what you.
your generosity of thought really comes so powerfully in this book. Also, this urgency. Something that came to my mind as I was reading was actually the title that Alexis Pauline Gumbs uses for one of her collections of poetry, Spill, which has this sense of knowledge, of information, of testimony that is overflowing the body, that needs to be in the world, that it's not just can't be contained, that it needs to be shared because it is about the community it comes from, it circulates around, and also informs our understanding of who we are, and who we are in connection to one another. I wondered if you've had that experience and felt that kind of urgent need to get this out. And if you could testify or speak to that process of what you felt needed to be said. What did you need? And also not just said, but also discovered, because there are a lot of discoveries, as you say, in this book and creating this project.
Again, connecting to what I said earlier about like the privilege of centering myself, the gift of centering myself in my work as someone trained in Black studies, it's a gift and a burden somehow. My dissertation focused on skin bleaching in Ghana, and I was moved to do that work because my maternal aunt bleached her skin for most of her adult life, and she died at an early age. And I set off on this path to try and figure out the connection between those products that she used, perhaps, and her untimely death. And it was a lot, you know. And I know many of us have spoken, whether to each other or publicly, but sometimes we can be traumatized by our own work, you know. Many of us, when we finish school, the first project that we do is we turn our dissertation into a book. I still haven't gone back to my dissertation, you know. And so in a lot of ways, One Drop might have been a distraction, you know, wanting to move forward. But the impetus for One Drop happened because I was on a panel at the Caribbean Cultural Center in New York. And I was asked to be on this panel with a group of folks from across the diaspora to talk about colorism in the diaspora. And I was on a panel with a woman who kept identifying as a Black Puerto Rican woman from the South Bronx. And I'm hearing her words and I'm looking at her body and I'm hearing her words and I'm looking at her body and I'm like, Black Puerto Rican? What's that? Because again, I grew up in New Orleans, right? I didn't grow up with a large Latinx community, let alone a Puerto Rican one. And so I thought I knew who a Puerto Rican was and what a Puerto Rican looked like, right? Again, the distance between what we learn, right? Because again, in theory, I know about diaspora. I have a PhD in Black Studies from Temple. I know about diaspora, but when I went to Puerto Rico and went to San Juan and was at the resort, I didn't see folks who identified as Black Puerto Rican. They identified as Puerto Rican. So again, given my experiences with folks who identified as Creole, I thought folks were identifying, even folks who look like me, right? I thought they were identifying as Puerto Rican as a way to also distance themselves from Blackness. And so here's the first time I'm seeing someone, and again, listen to my language, who didn't have to identify as Black, but did. And so I'm distracted on this panel as she speaks. This woman is Rosa Clemente. And so afterwards, Rosa and I talked. I'm like, we got to talk. And my mind is just spinning. And I started connecting dots to my own experiences and other people whose identities I may have questioned based upon what they look like. And so I just thought it would be a dope project, right? To merge photography, what people look like physically, with people's personal narratives and testimonies about their Blackness. And so it was, I mean, there was a lot of healing, a lot of discovering that happened in the process of doing the book. You know, I know that I learned a lot and changed. And if I can, I want to read from the outro of the book where I talk a little bit about this. And so I say, initially, I embarked upon One Drop to investigate, if you will, other people's Blackness. However, in the process of gathering, writing, editing, and compiling stories about other people's experiences with their skin color and racial identity, I have been forced to reflect on my own. The color of my skin is reflective of my Ghanaian ancestry, and by its dark tone, everyone I encounter knows exactly what I am, Black. Although I've lived most of my life acutely aware of the disadvantages assigned to my dark skin, especially growing up in New Orleans, it wasn't until I began having these conversations that I came to recognize some of the privileges my dark skin carries, the most profound of which is its ability to clearly communicate my racial identity, not only to other people, but to other Black people. They know I'm Black. I can rest assured that when someone in the room is talking about Black people, they realize that they are talking about my people. I also know that if I say, quote unquote, we, when talking about Black people, no one looks at me like I'm crazy. No one laughs at me as if I am somehow confused about my identity, and no one takes offense because they suspect I am somehow perpetrating a fraud. I have never had to defend my Blackness. My Black is that Black that everyone knows is Black for a fact. Does that somehow make me more Black than someone of mixed race or lighter complexion? Though peculiarly new in form, the question of who is Black is hauntingly familiar in function. Categorization for the sake of separation with the intent of domination. In the historical past, the one drop rule was functionary of white supremacy. It was predicated on the myth of white racial purity and thus served to protect and preserve whiteness. The one drop rule then became critical in the defense of the white race. Many Blacks, American Blacks specifically, have embraced the one drop rule with open arms and have in fact worn it like a badge of honor. As the saying goes, quote, once you go Black. We've come to see this as some sort of testament, if you will, to the power of Blackness, not the inferiority of Blackness. We didn't create it, but we've recodified it and given it new meaning such that somehow something genetic, cultural, and spiritual is transmitted through the blood that makes us who we are and connects us to one another. Though we know that Black folks come in all shapes, all sizes, all colors, and even in our own families, we don't necessarily see all Black people as the same or even treat all Black people the same. Given the history of race and racial mixing in this country, as well as the history of colorism and passing in this country, the antebellum and Jim Crow distrust of lighter skinned and mixed race people of African descent appears to linger on. Because historically, many sought to separate themselves from the masses of Black folk. Over time, the assumption has been that they don't see themselves as part of us or that they are only Black by default. The assumption is that if they could take on another identity, if they were permitted to take on another identity, biracial, multiracial, mixed, half Black, Cablinasian, other, that they would. Or the assumption is that in their lightness, in their mixedness, that they see themselves as somehow better than the majority of us. In response, or perhaps in retaliation, many of us turn the one drop rule on its head. Instead of using it to define Blackness, we reject it to defend Blackness. To be Black requires much more than one drop. The argument is that if whites can defend whiteness, so too should we defend Blackness. When people of African descent question or challenge the Blackness of someone of mixed heritage or light complexion, what is it that we are attempting to protect? And what is it that we stand to gain? There's more, but I'll stop there. And so I'm still questioning because there's so much conversation even now in public space about what is Blackness, who is Black, who gets to be Black, right? There's definitely lots of policing and lots of gatekeeping. And for me, I seek less to provide answers than it is to push us to continue to ask questions. I think all of the conversations are healthy, but again, that question of, and I've gotten lots of different answers and learned a lot, particularly in speaking, particularly around Afro-Latino identity, right? There's lots of conversation. Last week, around a West Side Story, right? Lots of conversation.
In the Heights, yeah.
Who gets to identify as Latinx, you know, who gets to identify as Afro-Latinx. I've learned a lot on both sides about what that means to folks who are living in the experience. And so for me, I want us to move away from solely relying upon racial definitions and historical definitions of race and begin to also think about our lived experiences, excuse me, with race.
Just hearing you say that and listening to you read, it's always exciting, because I think that this book and your work more generally really epitomizes the best aspects, the brilliance of Black study, which is that it's not a prescriptive, it's not a directive, it's a genuine and generous exploration of what Blackness has been, who it's existed for, and what are we negotiating? In some sense, really, what are the terms of our freedom, right? And kind of related to that, and the kind of form that this book and this study undertakes, it entails not only memoirs, but also portraits. And both of those were collaborative, right? Could you speak to the form, but also the process of pulling those together?
Sure. And we're not able to share screens, so I will show some portraits.
So folks need to buy the book.
But if you, and I'll show a photo when I talk about this particular story, but what's interesting, I'm sorry, excuse me. When I think about the process, what's also interesting is there was a web that was kind of weaved. Started with my experience talking with Rosa. So sorry. Made me reflect upon my own experiences. Made me think about a woman I went to grad school with who I know she hates, I tell this story all the time, but we had rap beef. She would say the beef was my end primarily, but Danielle, who was a grad student at Temple, and I ain't like her because she was acting like the light-skinned girls I grew up with in New Orleans. You know, Temple, very Black space. We had our common area on the 8th floor, Gladfelter Hall, and we were family, you know? And when she entered the program, like she would enter the space and not speak. And I'm like, what's happening here? You know, that was my stuff. It took me reading one of her papers in grad school. And then after speaking to Rosa, I reached out to her and she told me, she was like, I was so suspicious. Like, are you serious? Like, what do you want? But I reached out to her like, yo, I need to talk to you, like wanting to learn more about her story. And what she revealed about her story was just like, oh, this makes absolute sense, right? But then I also reached out to another woman who was a graduate student when I was a pre-doctoral fellow in Miami at Florida International, Noelle Théard, who did the principal photography in the book. And I remember the first time I met her, she's like, I'm Haitian. I'm Black, but I'm Haitian. And I'm like, you know, lots of Haitians in Miami, but I'm also looking at her like, what? Because it didn't fit with the image of what a Haitian looked like in my mind, right? So it was about disconnecting, unlearning, you know, opening up. And what I recognize is, for as well-traveled as I believe I am, even in the places and the spaces that I've moved through in the world, I say the same thing about New Orleans. Like, if you've only been to the French Quarter, you haven't been to New Orleans. So if I've only been to the resorts in San Juan, I haven't been to Puerto Rico. I haven't been to Haiti yet. But again, from what I've seen, we rely so much on the media to show us the world. If we don't physically get up and go into the world, it's whatever version they give to us, right? So again, didn't connect. But I connected with Noelle to do an interview. And as we were talking, we agreed that she would do the principal photography on the book. And so for me, you know, interestingly enough, the original plan for this conversation was that I was going to share a presentation with you all, but we're not able to screen share. And so I decided not to do it because there was no way I could read folks' testimony without allowing you to see their pictures. That's the point of the book. I want you to hear these words of someone who's telling you how they identify and match it, rectify it, if you will. Deal with your own stuff as you hear their words, read their words, and look at their faces, right? And so because that was the process of how I came to disconnect, if you will, with what I thought I knew, that's how I wanted to present it in the book. And so the one person's, if I had to pick one, there's so many, but the one person's narrative, I want to read a little bit from hers, but I first want to show you her picture. Her name is Joanne, and she's based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, why her story was important to me is attached to my work on skin bleaching, because in studying skin bleaching, Michael Jackson always comes up as the example, right? Oh, he bleached his skin. He wanted to be white. Look what he did to himself. Michael told us he had vitiligo, and we didn't believe him because this is what we imagine and what we know vitiligo to look like, right? This woman's name is Sembany. In speaking with Sembany, and also then speaking with Joanne, I came to learn what it meant to live with vitiligo, right? It's an autoimmune response. And when folks seek treatment, they're essentially given two options. You can wear makeup to try to make the lighter spots match, you know, your complexion, or you can bleach your skin. And by bleach, it's not the bleach that my aunt had access to or the bleach that we can get in the beauty supply store, but it's medication, right? There's all kinds of treatments you can do to make the skin a uniform color. And Michael had a lot of money. So because he was Michael, you know, I'm sure he didn't want to look or you know what I'm saying, present with vitiligo in the ways that we know it to manifest. So he may have likely done so, but our retelling, our translation of that was that Michael hated himself. And Michael wanted to be white. And I'm not here to defend Michael. Who knows what Michael was going through, right? But I use that as an example because, again, this web that I'm talking about, most of the people that I talked to in the book, it's because once I started telling people I was doing this project, they're like, you got to talk to this person. You got to talk to this person, right? And so I started meeting people. Joanne has vitiligo. And let me see the part that I want to read, and then I want to show you one other picture. She says, whenever I hear people make negative comments about Michael Jackson or speak about how they think he bleached his skin on purpose, I get really annoyed and become very defensive about it. They don't really know what his story was. I believe he had vitiligo. Nobody knows what he looked like beyond his hands and his face. His body could have been brown, or he could have been all one color. Look at me. He was a very popular entertainer. And even though I didn't want to bleach my own skin, I could understand why he might want to do that. But I don't think that he did it just because he wanted to look white. I always feel the need to come to his defense. I have the same thing that he had. Now, Joanne's story, she didn't bleach her skin. She lost all of her pigment because of vitiligo. This is her holding a photo of herself. She didn't choose.
That's extraordinary.
She lost all of her pigment because of this condition. And she says, I really, really admire people that have vitiligo, especially on their face, and don't cover it up, because I have to admit, I wasn't like that. I covered mine. I was embarrassed. I was always very concerned with my appearance and how I appeared to other people. I was ashamed of it because of how people made me feel. And when I see someone like Sembony, she seems to be very accepting of who she is and what she is. And I just wish that I had had that kind of confidence. I wish I had had enough confidence where I wouldn't have tried to cover it up so much. I admire her strength for accepting herself the way that she is. Vitiligo is not something that changes you as a person. I may not be the color I used to be, but I am the same person. I don't try to pass myself off as somebody that I'm not. I'm still who I've always been, a strong Black woman who is very proud to be a part of a race of people that have endured a lot.
Oh, I get chills.
What happens when we see her face on the street? Who do we assume she is? Right? And so again, race is so much more complicated than appearance.
It is. It can't just be a meme. And I get chills listening to you sharing and having done this incredible work of sharing people's stories and testimonies. And I imagine that folks who are watching and listening to you have questions, and I hope that they will leave some here. Though I also appreciate that this is a book and this is a project. In some ways, it's really unsettled, because you kind of move unsettled in the sense of there is no fixity of Blackness, that it's dynamic. I think when you spoke earlier, you said the period is never permanent. There's the project of naming ourselves, but also the power of imposed names. And I wanted to invite you to say, even that in certain ways the book resists kind of takeaways. If there is a kind of takeaway or even an orientation that you would want to invite your readers to go into your book with.
You know, you speak about the idea of there not being a fixity. And I know for some people that might be frustrating, because we're in so many ways seeking answers, right? We look to books for answers. I really like questions. This is a book that should make you question. Like if you walk away from this book with more questions, then I've done my work well, right? And by questions, I want you to question yourself and question your former experiences for the purposes of moving forward differently, perhaps, right? And so that you know, non-fixity is about an openness. This project absolutely made me more open. And that's something that actually made me even more proud to be Black, right? As opposed to trying to create a narrow box of this is us and that's y'all, which is really the project of white supremacy, but that's for another conversation. It helped me to say, like, this is us. Like, everywhere we go, there we are. Everywhere I go, there I am. And it's less about convincing someone else, because I've gotten a lot of heat and a lot of pushback from folks who strongly identify as mixed race, some folks who strongly identify as biracial, who feel like I'm imposing Blackness upon them. And my response is like, Blackness is too beautiful to be forced upon you. You don't want it, you don't have to. But I am very open to all the people who feel the honor of Blackness, who feel the honor of their ancestors, who claim this identity, who want to be a part of who, not who we are, who they are. So for me, it's the openness that brings me some level of joy and comfort.
It's certainly, it's a work, and your other work brings me joy and comfort, and I'm so grateful for it, for you. I said at the top, it really, I think it's kind of perfect. This is how I want to celebrate Juneteenth in Black study about being free, not policing Blackness, right? In exploring and celebrating, and not even just in the United States, because your scope is vast, right? And it's not even temporally determined, right? There's this evolution. So thank you so much for all of this. I think if I'm not mistaken, that it might be time to shift into our farewells and thank yous.
Really? We don't have any questions? We don't have time to talk?
There are questions. I mean, I have all the questions, and you stay on the chat and I'll just ask you a bunch of questions.
I'm sorry, I talked too much. We're over time.
Okay. One more, right? Well, maybe can we pick up on that question of thinking about the global diaspora, because there's this kind of the local and the global, the kind of it starts with the self, but also thinking about Blackness, as you spoke about your aunt, about what does Blackness mean in South Africa? What does it mean to be Haitian and identify as Black, right?
It's tricky.
Could you speak about the diaspora?
I mean, it's tricky.
Easy question.
And complex, right? Because thinking of my family, thinking of my parents were Ghanaian. And in Ghana, my father is Nzama, my mother is Kwa'u. They have their own ethnic and cultural identities. It wasn't until they migrated to this country that they became Black, right? So a lot of this conversation also triggers other conversations that we aren't having about the tension between us in the diaspora around the identity of Blackness. There are many people who feel like it is an identity that is imposed upon them and do not identify as Black. Now, I use the language of Black very specifically. I'm one of those people who gets annoyed when I see, a paper that asks me to identify and the only option is African American. I'm not African American, though I am technically, right? And so again, we can go, that's a whole nother conversation about language. Whole other conversation about whether or not to capitalize the B in Black. I always capitalize the B in Black because we're talking about people and culture and history. And so I came to understand Blackness as a bigger identity and use it deliberately to denote that larger identity under which we have all kinds of variations of cultural and ethnic, identity. So it's both and. I'm Black and I'm Ghanaian, right? But once we understand the politics of white supremacy, we understand when it's time to be Black and when it's time to be Ghanaian. Like, I'm not going to take that paper and check other and write Ghanaian if the person's only going to take that in the back and do what they want with it anyway. So how do I present and announce myself, right? And so I think there's so many conversations to have, that this is not just about what we see in the book. It's about opening us up to have more and more and more conversations so that we don't take our Blackness for granted.
Yeah. And yes to all of that. Amen to Ashe to all of that as well. And you're reminding me too, there's a way in which the book moves outwards. It kind of starts with this crushing story of a woman who thought that she knew who she was. And then found out that the state, or a few stories actually, where folks had and lived an identity that was theirs, and that the state, and this is in the US context, but the state intervened to tell them who they were and really what they could do with their bodies.
No matter
right?
what you look like. And
No
that's
matter
the
what you look like.
drop rule. We don't care what you look like. If we can trace one Black person 5 generations Black, we don't care what you look like. Because race isn't about what you look like. Race was about power. They attempted to define whiteness as pure. And any Blackness or any otherness anywhere 5 generations back would soil that purity. And so you don't get access to this privilege. You don't get access to this identity. No matter what you look like, we are going to name you colored, Negro, Black, whatever the language is at the time. So allegedly we're beyond that history. So what do we do once we're free? How do we name ourselves once we're free?
Yeah. And as you're saying, multiple contexts, how do you hold on to your ethnicity, right? If you are a recent immigrant, right? Or let's say post Jim Crow or immigrant to the US. Or even how do
or even beyond that, I'm sorry to cut you off, even beyond that, right? You know, one of the people I was going to talk about in the book, in my presentation that I wasn't able to share, let me find her photo quickly if I can. Dr. Kokuzada Tusalasi, who I was actually her teaching assistant at
Really?
And
she's getting so much love lately. It's so lovely to see.
This garden, absolutely. But from the moment I met her, she said, I'm African, right? For her, her identity is less about what these people said my people were, who they said we were, and about holding on to the cultural origins of from where I come. She said, I'm African. Culturally, I'm African. Even if I grew up in LA and my people come from New Orleans, when you look at what we do, how we speak, how we move, how we pray, everything that we do connects to Africa. So why should I not call myself an African? And I had another conversation with her recently, again, about language, because she's a professor of English. And she's like, you know, I always felt a way about the language of African American because you're using African to qualify the American. If I must use the language, let me be an American African. So again,
which brings,
how are we going to talk about this? How are we willing to explore our identities? That we have the option, as you say, to move out, that we aren't constricted and confined by these narrow definitions of race and identity that have been given to us.
Yeah, and I think that's something that comes up when you're saying that is when we are able to define ourselves in our own terms, we are able to forge the connections that we want to make, right? And be connected to people. Maybe something about that kind of sense of self-determination comes through in a question that we received, which is that colorism is one way that Blackness is policed. Other constraints are around things that aren't metaphorically or historically constituted by blood. Can you talk about some of the other constraints of policing Blackness?
I think what I hear in that question, at least what it made me think about, the other ways that we police Blackness in terms of speaking Black, that's something, right, that happens. I know a lot of us folk, particularly those connected to the academy, lots of questions about, you know, how we speak, how we posture even, and whether or not that connects to Blackness. The things we do, I think there's a way that we limit Blackness and say, you know, either all Black people do things, or if you were Black, you would do it this way. And I don't know that we are yet able to even open up the constraints of Blackness, if there are any, to include all of those things, right? That there's a cultural nuance that we infuse with all of those things, as opposed to assuming that we're only taking on a performative type of whiteness. Maybe that's what I think of. But I think, what are you thinking, Dr. Baker? I think there are a lot of ways that we think about Blackness beyond skin color.
I think that's right. And I think that you're getting at this, you know, there's self-determination, and also, and this, I think this, it's so wonderful, your book illustrates this so wonderfully. There's the self-determination, we know who we are, and we are many things, but there are also real forces, right? Very powerful forces that are invested in maintaining boundaries of Blackness that don't necessarily serve us. And I think that, you know, your book really, through the testimonies, through the memoirs and the images, really, really provides a beautiful wedge open into the fixity of those terms so that we can indulge in beauty.
It's making me, I spend a lot of time on social media, but it's making me think of a video that's been going around Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Folks are giving this person a lot of backlash who apparently identifies as biracial. There's a video where I feel like either the caption, something says, you know, when people don't know that, you know, you're biracial or you're mixed or whatever the languages you use, and you got to show them who you are. And so he goes from presenting as, you know, white presenting person, and then he like turns on some hip hop and puts a gold chain on. He might even put on a do-rag. But again, is that all that we know Blackness to be? Is that the only way that you can prove your Blackness? We don't all come from the quote unquote quote hood, wherever that is. You know what I mean? Some of us don't like, well, not us, because I do, but some folks, some folks don't like hip hop or rap music. What's the little girl's name? Willow Smith. She has a dope new song out, and it is so hardcore rock music, and I like it. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, we are everywhere. We could do everything.
I don't know. Again, a longer conversation, a broader conversation, but it's definitely a question of how we limit Blackness and how it doesn't serve us ultimately.
Right. Well, thank you for expanding our images and ideas of Blackness.
Thank
and
you.
With that, I'm going to bring this to a close and invite folks to tune in on the Langston Hughes virtual stage to hear Ben O'Cree, author of Prayer for the Living, with moderator Chris Abani. And at 1:15 on the Nella Larson virtual stage, which I think is the one that we are on. Stay tuned and hear from Honoré Fanon Jeffers, author of The Age of Phyllis and Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. Joining her in conversations will be Joy Bibbins, director of the Schomburg Center. Dr. Blay, if you would like to close us out. And
happy Juneteenth.
Happy Juneteenth. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
I'm Jane Allen, the author of Black Girls Must Die Exhausted. And the selection that I'm going to read for you is from about the middle of the book, page 213. And in it, the protagonist, Tabitha Walker, Tabby, is speaking with her grandmother. And Tabby happens to be a Black woman. Her grandmother, who happens to be her namesake, is a white woman. And they have the most loving and intimate relationship. But even in the context of that relationship, they're going to ask each other a very difficult question. And what was very interesting for me as an author was to explore the conversations that are typically just past the point of everyday courage for most people. And it was really an honor and a challenge to craft this from the vantage point of these particular characters, and I hope you enjoy. Granny Tab, can I ask you a silly question? I asked, even though I already knew I could ask my grandmother anything. But this time what I wanted to know felt foreign as a thought and strange coming from my lips. What does it feel like to be white? My grandmother absorbed my words, took a deep breath, took off her glasses, and squinted just a bit, which told me she was thinking. I've asked myself the same question on occasion when I was reminded of it, most of the time by cruel people when I was with my son, your father, she said quickly, touching my knee. I look at him sometimes and look at me and wonder how we could live in a world that treated the two of us so differently when he came from my own body. My skin color changed in the sun too, just like him, just like yours, just not as dark. But believe me, I tried, she said with a smile, running her pale fingers soothingly across my golden brown arm. I try to think, was white a hair texture, a state of mind? I could never put my finger on it. Maybe it was just what we were told it was supposed to be, because I've never felt white. My grandmother shook her head softly before continuing. So the best I can tell you is that as I've experienced it, it's more of a what it's not than a what it is. I mean, I get reminded of being a woman all the time, but being white? She brought her hand to her face and gently rubbed her cheek. Sometimes when there's no friction, no reminder of what you can't do, it feels like a hole that needs to be filled with something, so desperately. Filled so there is a something. Your dad, then you, my grandchildren, you have been my greatest something. And I don't know that there is any more than that. We sat still for a moment after that, both of us contemplating her words. It was some time before she spoke again. I never thought to ask it of anyone, not even your dad, whose whole life I watched. Yours too, I guess. I thought I understood from observation, and it never occurred to me how silly that might be not to ask until just now. I reckon I should ask you too. What's it feel like to be black? Do you consider yourself black? I laughed a bit in answering. I don't think I have much of a choice, Granny Tab, I said with a smile. Freedom means to me the ability to captain your own ship, to know that you're captaining your own ship, and a sense of well-being while doing it. And the freedom practice that my characters are on, the freedom journey, is really becoming aware of their true dreams, a sense of self-determination, and starting to ask the questions that put them on the path to realizing those dreams, which to me is a path to freedom. It seems like our dreams call us to freedom. It's our dreams that first start to call us toward freedom, and that's the first step on the path, at least as I've experienced it. And what I want for readers of my work is freedom. I want to start to encourage the asking of the questions, important questions that start the path and form the entrance to the road to freedom. And if my work can do that, can start to bring those questions to the forefront and make them part of conversations, either self-exploration or conversations with others, then I would, that's fulfilling a purpose for my work.